In 1930, the St Kilda archipelago was finally abandoned to wildlife after centuries of human habitation. The main island of St Kilda, Herta, housed most of the population of around 180 residents in the late 17th century, falling to 90 in the census of 15th June 1764, rising to 112 in 1851. By 1928, this had diminished to just 45, and by the summer of 1930, only 36 residents lived on Herta. These included ancestors of 5 families recorded in the 18th century census: the McQueens, Fergusons, MacDonalds, McKinnons and Gillies. Life was proving increasingly difficult, so they decided to do something about it. The island of Herta measures roughly 3 miles by 2 miles, with only one easily accessible landing place, and for 8 months of the year, the islanders were cut off from the mainland due to the rough seas. Their only livestock were a small number of black-faced sheep, which ate what little vegetation there was. Food was scarce, so the islanders took to killing wildfowl and seabirds and eating their eggs, their main source of food, in 1930. The men, who were expert at climbing on the rocky precipices, divided the cliff into sections, and this was allocated to each man. Once the gathering of the birds was completed, the birds were divided equally among them. A native breed of collie dog was used to catch puffins, while the cats on the island killed the mice, although there were never any rats on the island. The first visitors to Herta are thought to have been Bronze Age hunter-gatherers looking for seals, fish and seabirds, and was first referred to in early records as Hert, Herta, Herth and Hythra, all of which came from the Gaelic, meaning West Country. It's also surmised that it could have derived from the Old Norse skildr, meaning shield, as the island resembles a shield from a distance. In the 14th century, the island is mentioned in a charter in which John MacDonald, Lord of the Isles, formally handed over the property to his son, Ranald. Robert II, in another charter, confirmed this legally. The island then passed to the MacDonalds of Slate, then to the MacLeods of Dunvegan. In 1779, the island went up for sale again, but in 1871 the MacLeods bought it back for £3,000, having regretted its sale in the 18th century. In the 17th century, although the island was small, it boasted 3 churches, all of which seem to have been fairly substantial and well equipped. In 1697, the population stood at 180, and Magnus Martin wrote that they were remarkable for their beauty and virtue, and that their condition was that which the people in the Golden Age is feigned to be by the poets. They were free from solicitous cares, from envy, deceit, and dissimulation, from ambition and pride, and the consequences that attend them. He also said there were 30 horses on the island, but these were later shipped to the mainland by the laird, who thought they damaged the grass too much. At the same time, Highland cattle were bred on the island, but again the laird had the calves shipped to the mainland. Although the island is surrounded by the sea, the St Kildans didn't eat fish, as they thought it made their skin break out, and during the 19th century, cultivation of the land dropped by around half. In 1800, there were 2,000 sheep on the St Kilda archipelago, but by the 1920s, there were only just enough to provide the inhabitants with mutton and wool, with the wool being plucked rather than shorn from the sheep and made into blankets. The women did the spinning and dyeing of the wool, while the men did the weaving and tailoring. The 1921 census was drawn up by the Registrar General for Scotland, Dr. James Crawford Dunlop, who travelled to the island on HMS Mistley and recorded 73 people living on the island. It had been 74, but 65-year-old Marion McQueen, wife of Donald McQueen, died before Census Day, 19th June. The island had been hit by a whooping cough outbreak that year, thought to have been brought to the island by 2 tourists, affecting half the islanders. And the seabird season was badly affected by stormy weather. On 10th May 1930, the islanders, through Dugald Munro, the resident missionary and schoolteacher, petitioned the Labour government's Secretary of State for Scotland, William Adamson MP, to help them be removed from the island and relocated to the mainland, and for the men to have jobs to go to. At the time, the only village on the island consisted of a church, a manse, the factor's house, a store, and just over 10 cottages, some of which had zinc roofs, while others were thatched. Each stood around 20 yards apart and formed a crescent shape around the bay. There was also a resident nurse, Williamina Barclay, who persuaded the islanders to move to the mainland. This was brought home by the death of 2 women that year. On 26 May, 35-year-old Mary Gillies of 10 Main Street died in Glasgow following complications during childbirth. Her baby Annie also died. Another Mary Gillies, aged 22, died at 14 Main Street of tuberculosis. Living on the island was always a hard way of life, even with the coming of wireless communication, which didn't make a whole deal of difference to them. A supply ship landed once a year, but this wasn't enough to sustain them. Tetanus was another factor in their decision to leave, as it had ravaged the island for nearly 100 years, but also help during emergencies was 110 miles away at least. On Friday, 29th August 1930, household effects and livestock were boarded onto the steamer Donara Castle, with the fisheries cruiser HMS Harebell assisting. 573 sheep were transported out to the waiting ship on small boats, while the 13 cattle swam out. These were all sold, and eventually their owners were paid. All the records for the islands were removed by the Registrar for the Northern District. Then the Donara Castle set sail for Oban. The islanders boarded Harebell and watched as their former home drifted out of sight. They landed in the district of Lochaline on the mainland and were allocated new homes, meaning that for the first time they would be able to pour water from a tap. The owner of the island, Reginald MacLeod, backed the islanders who wanted to leave, but he wanted no part in it for fear of being labelled as the man who cleared it. He also thought it unlikely anyone would ever live there on a permanent basis again. The islanders, meanwhile, were resigned to their fate, but not enthusiastic about the move, with most of them knowing nothing about the mainland or its modern way of life. According to Monroe, every family was offered a house, a piece of land for either grazing or agriculture, and the men were guaranteed work with the Forestry Commission for 153 days a year. However, since childhood, all they had known was crag work, so would have to learn new skills. Even their weaving had been done on ancient hand looms, and the women only knew spinning. Most settled in Morvern in Argyll, with some going to Stromferry in Rossshire, Inverness-shire, and a few to Curras in Fife. While in Argyll, the men also repaired roads and fences, and it's recorded that one family, the McKinnons, brought in a weekly wage of between £6 and £7, much more than the £30 a year they eked out on the island, although they had to pay rent, buy food and clothing, and pay for heating and transport. They had been one of the families worst affected in 1929, when they nearly starved to death in the winter of that year, and were instrumental in St Kilda being evacuated for that very reason. However, tragedy struck the family anyway, with 4 of their children dying of tuberculosis in 1936. Many of the older women never adapted to mainland life and died soon after moving to Argyll. Other women found themselves isolated from the women they'd grown up with and knew intimately. Some of the belongings of the Herta folk were sold, as they only left with what they could carry, as well as the church's baptismal font. John Crichton Stewart, the Earl of Dumfries, and later 4th Marquess of Bute, bought St Kilda after its evacuation as a bird sanctuary, and every summer some St Kildans were allowed to return to Herta, a pilgrimage to what was their home, but mainly to maintain the old manse and factor's house for the Marquess. However, with the outbreak of World War II, these visits were stopped and were never resumed. In 1932, it was restocked with Soay sheep, which still live on the island. In November 1987, the last person to be born on St Kilda, Neil McKinnon, died at Fortrose on the Black Isle. He was 3 when his family were evacuated. In April 2016, Rachel Johnson, born Gillies, died aged 93 and was the last surviving native St Kildan. The most famous inhabitant of St Kilda was Rachel Cheesley, Lady Grange, wife of James Erskine, Lord Grange, advocate, judge and politician. After 25 years of marriage and 9 children, the couple split acrimoniously, with her claiming her husband plotted against the Hanoverian government. Furious at the accusation, Erskine had his wife kidnapped in January 1732 from her home in Nidries Wynd in Edinburgh. Following her incarceration in various places in the West, she ended up on St Kilda in the summer of 1734, where she stayed until 1740. She died on 12th May 1745 on Skye, aged 66. The story of St Kilda, or Herta, is one of survival in the face of ever-increasing adversity. The evacuation was a necessity, but today, the islands, owned by the National Trust for Scotland since 1957, welcomes tourists and wildlife enthusiasts during the summer season who can see a myriad of seabirds, including puffins, fulmars and gannets, and reflect on what has been. A military presence has been on Herta since 1957, although today is mainly civilian, and they stay there all year round. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of only 39 in the world, and the first in Scotland, having been granted the status in 1986. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.